Now, this idea caught root during college when I was actually training to be a master manipulator. I'm formally trained in communication and PR, which are the mother lode of manipulation. Back then, I was arrogant and I already had a great knack for manipulation. But as I grew up, I realized how these attempts made me feel when they were directed at me. And I was someone who could spot and avoid most of them. So if we look at early adopters, for instance, they are the people who want to be in on the secret. So to them, you're going to speak about vision, edge, even status. This is what they're buying, essentially. They're not buying a product, they're buying status. The beachhead buyers, on the other hand, they need proof that it works. To them, you're going to talk about results, relevance, some quick wins. When you're finally at the mainstream stage, then you need to dial up the reassurance. This is where social proof becomes your best friend. You need to talk about risk reduction, maybe something like money back guaranteed within 3 days, and you need to make sure you fit within a category. But what most people do is that they start using the mainstream messaging way too early. And you cannot sell a revolution if you sound like corporate HR.
Welcome. Our guest today is Adriana Tica. She's a marketing strategist, trend analyst, and writer who helps people build and grow a future-proof, sustainable business. I've known Adriana for a while, and she's definitely all about creating no BS, zero hacks marketing strategies. Welcome, Adriana.
Thank you, Vaughn. Always a pleasure chatting with you.
So look, what we're looking to do here is just diving in around your approach to human-centered marketing, promotion, etc. But perhaps before we get into that, can you share a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. So to understand what I do, you really only need to know one thing. I want to help experts and business leaders make FU money without selling their souls. So I'm on a mission to teach people that you don't need to be a manipulative jerk to make money, nor do you need shady tactics, bro marketing, or hacks. So overall, you can be rich and be able to live with yourself. Now, this idea caught root during college when I was actually training to be a master manipulator. I'm formally trained in communication and PR, which are the mother lode of manipulation. Back then, I was arrogant and I already had a great knack for manipulation. But as I grew up, I realized how these attempts made me feel when they were directed at me. And I was someone who could spot and avoid most of them, which led me to ask myself, what about the people who didn't have a natural flair for manipulation and the formal education to go with it? So essentially, I did a 180 and I decided to teach people how to be great business leaders by nailing their strategy, not by trying the umpteenth trending hack and by um, coercing people into buying stuff they don't need. These days, and I've been doing this for over 18 years, I help people become better marketers through strategy and making sure that they build a business they actually enjoy leading.
No, so you love that, and I love that phrase, "FU money without selling your soul." Really cool.
Yeah,
I think that's going to
it
fit
ties
right in.
it ties in well with the name of my newsletter, Strategic AF, because after all, this is what I'm about, teaching people how to be strategic AF.
Love it, love it. Well, just thinking about that, how to be strategic. Perhaps let's start with a bit around positioning. So, in a lot of situations with our duck tree method, it helps right across the board for larger organizations that are perhaps coming up with new products and services or business models, that sort of thing. But definitely also we find it works really well in the startup space as well. So for those who are perhaps in the early stages of their idea, how do you help founders find, clarity when they're actually not even sure what their final product might be?
That's a great question. In my work with startups, I found that in the earliest stage, the goal isn't actually to nail the pitch. It's to reduce the cognitive dissonance from within your team. Because early positioning is less about persuading the outside world and more about making sense of the thing with each other, with the team members, and so on. So essentially, what I do is treat positioning like scaffolding for strategic decisions. If the team can't explain what problem they're solving, for whom, and why it matters, no amount of roadmap planning is going to save them. So I found this a lot in early stage startups, and this applies well beyond tech, even in solo businesses, that if your internal story is fuzzy, your external strategy would be chaos dressed as hustle. It's essentially like putting lipstick on a pig, you know?
Excellent. Yeah, look, I do find that a lot. Like even often we're working with people who are really good at building the thing, and and what we find is like even 2 or 3 years in, is a lot of lack, I suppose, lack of clarity and alignment amongst the founders that about exactly what you said there about, what we're building, who it's for, what the real problem is that we're solving. So look, I love that. And so do you have any sort of initial kind of tips, like how you might go about unpacking that a bit for those early stage founders?
If you think about from the leader's perspective, I think what you need to understand is that everyone in your team has a different narrative and they all have different focuses, right? So the CFO will be focused on different things than the sales team and the marketing team. And your job is not necessarily to explain your own vision, but to make sure that you build a narrative that everyone can see themselves in and everyone can see the part that they're playing in that narrative. You need to acknowledge that people look at the product and at every decision from different angles. And this is where the strength really is at. This is why building a team makes sense in certain businesses, right? Because you don't want to be the only one who makes decisions, the only one with a point of view.
Sure, sure. So when you're working with teams around doing that, like, is there any sort of particular approach that you might take, like in a workshop or something like that, in order to help craft those stories that are more aligned?
I normally try to take the teams or part of the team, I try to get them to strip down all the jargon and
Mhm.
get back to the bare bones. I get them to tell me, okay, who is it for? Who is it helping? Why are you building this? And very importantly, get them to think beyond money. Of course, you have a business. This is the primary goal of a business, to make money, right? But when you decided to build this and not that, you had a reason why you chose that. And when you strip down all the pitch talking and the VC stuff, you essentially get down to the essence, to why people are doing what they're doing. Another tool that helps a lot, maybe not necessarily for early founders, but for later stage founders, when they start to move farther from their initial mission and they sort of feel lost, like we started this with one vision, but now it's become very diluted and we can no longer see ourselves in it. What helps is I guide them to the language their customers use. I help them gather voice of customer goals so that they
Yeah.
can look at it through the customer's eyes.
And getting rid of that jargon, I think, even I love the word innovation, but it means so much to so many people, and there's just so much jargon in various sectors. So I really like the approach there of getting rid of the jargon and also connecting to that deeper purpose, right? So you mentioned the word choices. So why have they chosen to work on this particular problem, and even, let's say, that solution, etc.? Why have they chosen to do that? Because ultimately, in the end, we're trying to help customers make a choice between whatever you're offering and something else, right? So, I really like that thinking. So, in terms of, let's just say, well, as I understand, you've worked across many, many sort of industries and sectors and that. So, can you sort of describe for me, help me understand a little bit how your approach to messaging might shift, let's say, from when founders are working with perhaps early adopters, then moving into their initial kind of beachhead market or initial target market, and then before it becomes hopefully sort of a bit more sort of mainstream into other audiences. So, like, how might the story kind of shift?
So I'm going to start with the biggest mistake I see, and this is using mainstream language before you're ready to. So your messaging should evolve as your audience matures, and more importantly, it shouldn't just be rooted in content and wording and so on. It should be rooted in psychology. because that's the root of all good communication, marketing, writing, and so on. So if we look at early adopters, for instance, they're the people who want to be in on the secret. So to them, you're going to speak about vision, edge, even status. This is what they're buying, essentially. They're not buying a product, they're buying status. The beachhead buyers, on the other hand, they need proof that it works. To them, you're going to talk about results, relevance, some quick wins. When you're finally at the mainstream stage, then you need to dial up the reassurance. This is where social proof becomes your best friend. You need to talk about risk reduction, maybe something like money back guaranteed within 3 days. And you need to make sure you fit within a category. But what most people do is that they start using the mainstream messaging way too early. And you cannot sell a revolution if you sound like corporate HR. This is not what the early adopters want. They want something new, they want something unpolished. If you sound like everyone else, they don't want it, because to them it makes it clear that they're no longer early adopters, or at least they don't feel like early adopters, even though technically they are.
Right. Okay. No, look, that makes a lot of sense. Um, do you have any sort of advice when perhaps, an organization is actually moving through those phases, and so then ultimately, some way, if I'm understanding it right, in some way you will still need some of that messaging for various stages that potential customers are at, even though your organization may be sort of more mainstream now. So how do you sort of incorporate that into your activities of communication as a startup that's been going 2 or 3 years maybe?
The first thing you need to do is be clear about the stage you're in, right? You need to understand when you're moving past the early adopter stage. This is when you can dial back the talk about vision and status, and you need to show more proof because now you have it. You have some early adopters who can give you that proof. You can talk about the result, the relevance, and so on. You still have a critical mass of people, the beachhead buyers, right? They're still pretty early. They're still going to be proud to be there. But for them, it's not all about status and edge. They actually want something from your product. And then when you've reached a critical mass of buyers and your product is mainstream, it ends up in mainstream media. You're not just showing up in niche publications or blogs or newsletters. Then you can pretty much follow the industry best practices. You need to cram social proof as much as possible. You've known me for a while, I'm a diehard fan of social proof. It always helps. So if you want to, for instance, if you were to work with influencers to promote your product, right, you wouldn't hire someone like say Brad Pitt to speak to early adopters. You would hire maybe an obscure actor, maybe someone who works for noir movies made by the Danish people,
Okay.
if it fits your audience. As you move along the stages, when you go to mainstream buyers, then's your chance to work with, I don't know, mainstream actors like Brad Pitt, George Clooney, and so on,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
you need to speak to the masses.
Love that, love that. And yeah, I take your point there on social proof. It's I love receiving your newsletter, and sometimes I'm too busy and I don't get to read it. But then usually a couple of times a week there's a reminder and a bit of social proof around the value of your newsletter. So it always makes me sort of go back and make sure I'm catching up on the latest. So really appreciate that point. And the
That's actually great. Sorry, I was just gonna say that's actually great to know because I thought social proof was only helping me get more people to subscribe.
yeah, yeah.
But it's amazing to know that it's a good reminder for one of my older subscribers.
Yeah, absolutely. It sort of also reminds me that I need to do a better job of around mine, reminding people. Look, with testing and within innovation, we're always often talking about building a prototype, perhaps eventually moving to a minimum viable product. But we're not often talking about testing messaging, testing copywriting, etc. So, how in your approach do you test copy and positioning as part of validation of desirability of for the audience of the product or service you're offering?
I love this question because I feel like it does my trade justice, you know? People obsess a lot about testing MVPs and putting a good prototype out there, but they kind of forget that messaging is the ultimate prototype, right? You can use words as the fastest way to test resonance. And I'm talking landing pages, cold emails, even the awkward DMs you send in the beginning when you're about to launch something. And you know, with messaging, you're not just testing whether someone clicks, you're also testing demand, urgency, category fit, you know, trust signals, ROI clarity, all that good stuff, all through language. Because before you build a product, you should be able to build a sentence that people know that. If that resonates with people, then you've got some solid ground to work on. And I think ultimately copy can act as the ultimate MVP. It's faster and it's cheaper to test messaging before you build anything at all.
Love that. So, do you kind of have a bit of an example there that you could provide around how you tested some messaging, perhaps for a new product, even if it's your own, just to give that example, how you went about that, and how long it sort of took you to sort of perhaps nail the language, the messaging, etc.
I actually didn't take my own advice and I built a product a couple of years ago. I built a product that is essentially a strategy framework, something that helps you create your own strategy from scratch. It's a template that walks you through every step that you need to build a strategy. It's obviously far more complicated than what you can find out there, but my initial messaging was a bit fuzzy. I didn't tell people what the end product was. I played with calling it either a framework or a template. But when I managed to change the language and tell people that, hey, instead of spending days creating your strategy, you can spend hours because you have me in your corner at every stage of the way, this changed everything in terms of sales because this is what people wanted. I spoke to a bunch of my clients and they told me the reason they didn't have a documented strategy was that it took too long, or if they downloaded a template off the internet, they didn't understand some of the words. So, okay, they need help and they need speed, which is essentially what most people need. So, tweaking those few things kind of flipped the script on my product.
Love that. And from what I understand, it's going very well. I see it advertised on LinkedIn a fair bit. So you're happy with the kind of end evolution of it?
Yes, yes, I am. And it's a good reminder that I need to promote it more.
Love that. Love that. So that's the kind of external piece when we're sort of messaging to customers and that. So what I'd like to sort of maybe talk a bit about now is stakeholder alignment. Look, often we're thinking about that it's a process thing that we need to keep people informed, etc., along the journey and etc. But this key part of helping them become part of, I suppose, the journey and the evolution of things. Like, I think there's a bit of a story problem often with our approach. So, like, for leaders of any organization that's kind of innovating in some way, bringing new product service to market, whatever it is, or even if it's just internally within an organization that may improve processes, that sort of thing. So how do you sort of get that story happening and build some momentum so that you can actually move towards implementing a lot easier?
I think this relates very well to when we were talking earlier about every member of the team having a different story in their mind about the product and so on. And you're absolutely right. Most alignment problems, they're not at all about processes because, of course, the process is going to look different in every department. They're about incompatible stories, if you will. The different stakeholders, they interpret risk and value based on their own frame. So the CFO might look for efficiency, the head of sales might look for revenue, the marketing department might look for engagement. This is why I think that the leaders, they don't necessarily need to translate the strategy. That's not the job to repeat it until everyone gets tired of it. It means, how do I put this? Telling the same core story in different dialects. You know, you speak the language your CFO speaks, the language your head of sales speaks, and so on. And more importantly, the language that the users speak. Because if the CFO thinks about efficiency, the head of sales thinks about revenue. For the users, it's about pain relief. Whatever you're selling, it has to bring some sort of relief from a pain they're experiencing, right? So you can't, it's not something that you can fix with a memo, right? You need to build a narrative that everyone can see themselves in. And it's, as I was saying earlier, maybe it's easier to think about it in terms of a story where everyone gets assigned a different character, but they all have an important part to play in the plot.
Sure. Okay. So when you're in sort of, let's say, executive meeting, perhaps you're presenting a status update of where we're at with this project. How would you sort of, do you have any sort of tactics or ways that you would go about it? Because, if we've got, let's say, 6 different leaders with different roles in the room there, and you're mentioning around the same core story, how do you maybe tailor it? Do you add bits that speak to each different person, or how would you approach that if we're in a decision-making meeting about whether this is gonna proceed or not?
So if I'm looking to get buy-in, the biggest part of my presentation is going to be focused on the dialect that the key person of interest is talking, right? So if I'm trying to get buy-in from the CFO, I'm going to talk about revenue. If I'm trying to get buy-in from the CEO, I'm probably going to talk about vision and where we're going to be in 5 years from now. And if you need to get buy-in from all of these people, then it's going to be complicated because again, they speak different languages and you need to make sure you have a little bit a thread that connects you to each of them. And I think one of the things I'm seeing when these things are happening is that a lot of people go for the big guy, for the CEO, because they see him as the one decision maker. In reality, things don't happen this way. The CEO is going to talk to the CFO and to the CTO and to pretty much everyone in the room. So you need to acknowledge that everyone has a seat at the table and address all their concerns and objections.
Perhaps sticking with, the same sort of or similar scenario, but going a bit broader. So, like, in sort of innovation, let's say, corporate innovation, how might you sort of approach keeping, let's say, general staff kind of involved? Because what I've through failure is that often, if we're not bringing the entire team on this journey and enabling some sort of way that they can actually contribute to the whole kind of project, I've had experiences where I haven't done that very well, and there's been in some way, a total disconnect, but even the extent of perhaps saboteur of the project itself. So, do you have any sort of tips there to sort of support people who perhaps even their role could be changed because of the effect of this?
It depends a lot on the size of the team, right? So the first thing you need to do is obviously talk to every head of department and make sure that they're doing their job in championing the project and being very clear about how certain roles might change. And then if you know for a fact that certain people are going to be affected in a negative way, I find that contrary to what most corporate policies do, it's a bad idea to hide that until the last moment because people catch on, they sense the disturbance in the force and there's no point in lying to them and telling them that, hey, it's just business as usual. They'd be much better off scheduling one-on-one meetings with each of these people and trying to explain your vision better, to explain how they can be part of this new narrative and so on. I know it's a very radical take, but when given the choice, I'm always going to opt for transparency above all.
Yeah, no, I love that, and generally my approach would be these days is to immerse myself as much as I can. If I'm doing a piece of work with an organisation, is try and spend some time in there, getting to know some people, like you say, perhaps having some one-on-ones where we can, and those one-on-ones could maybe even be just around the cooler or around in the cafeteria, that sort of thing. Just having a bit of a chat so that I can understand the broader context and perhaps some fears and that they have going on. So, I generally take on board what you're saying there around, spending some time with people to understand, what's happening for them.
Yep. And
I'm just
especially in corporate settings where it's very easy to sort of dehumanize people. You
Yeah.
look at them and you see a team, you see a mass of people, but each team is made up of individuals and they all have their own fears, their own goals, and so on.
Often we seem to forget in business that ultimately it's about people, and people have to make a decision whether or not to use your service. That's kind of and to work for you, and likewise. So, no, thank you for that. Just wondering if you're able to perhaps draw on a case story where you sort of worked on creating some better positioning that maybe if the organization or the team was kind of stuck in the innovation process and it really helped them get unstuck, and actually ended up, helping them be successful in terms of either implementing the innovation in some way.
I do. I think my best success story that applies to this framework actually comes from a solo business. I worked with someone who was selling a sort of a business systems course for solo founders. And you know what? It was actually good. It was thoughtful, it was well structured, and it was actually useful, which is a miracle in this space, these days. But the trouble was that they were calling it something like the entrepreneur operating method or something like that. And it was very vague. No one knew what it meant. It essentially sounded like a McKinsey consultant trying to sell something to people who are essentially just trying not to forget about their calls. They just need a calendar. So we worked a bit on positioning and reframing because if the product's good, it's obviously a problem of positioning and messaging. So I kept asking, what does your buyer actually want? What do they want at 11 p.m. when their brain is fried? And eventually we got to this answer that essentially said they want to feel like things won't fall through the cracks if they take a day off, because that's a big problem when you're leading a business. So we changed the pitch, the headline, whatever you want to call it, to a repeatable system to run your solo business even when you're offline. And this copy hit way better. My clients started getting replies like, "Oh my God, I need this like yesterday. Sales jumped," and she didn't have to change the content of the product at all. She ran with the same product. It was just positioned differently. It didn't sound like something extremely pretentious, but very vague. I think the McKinsey comparison is very fair because this is what most people think about when when they look at high-end consulting. A lot of buzzwords, you don't exactly know what they mean. And in this world, people close down those pages and they don't want systems, they want peace of mind. And worse yet, if what you're studying sounds like homework, people are going to treat it like high school algebra. They're going to ghost it. They don't want that. They don't need that.
Right. I love that. So, would you mind perhaps just diving in a little bit around some of the tactics, like how did you learn about what were the ways that you went about learning these words to be able to connect better with the audience?
So essentially, you have two sources to do that. My preferred source is always customer language. This involves you talking to people and asking them what's hurting, sort of like a doctor making a diagnosis. When you walk into a doctor's office, the first thing they're going to ask you is what's hurting. It's not about your history. A lot of people get lost in gathering a ton of socio-demographic data. They know the shoe size of their customers, even though they're selling CRMs, and this is completely irrelevant. So, my advice to most of my clients is to think like a doctor. You start with what's hurting. From there on, you can start asking about medical history so that you can tie that pain to something in the client's history. But the first thing you need to know is what's hurting right now and what do they need a fix for. And more importantly, you need to record that language because when you build your own product, you also build a jargon around it. And that jargon is not going to work on someone who hasn't heard about your product at all. It works with you, it works with your team, you have your own acronyms and stuff, but you also need to get out there and learn the way your customers are talking about either your product or whatever else they're using as an alternative to relieve that pain.
Nice. Okay. So if you're a founder and either very early on in the business or perhaps struggling a wee bit with raising awareness, gaining some sort of attraction or traction for that. And what would you recommend? Would you recommend that the founders are actually going out and speaking with customers, or because what I find is often if they're very much around the building the product, and there's somewhat of an apprehension to do face to face. Like what would your approach be to recommend to founders or business leaders that are even wanting to perhaps provide a new product or service?
The best piece of advice is actually Paul Graham's do the things that don't scale first. And of those things that don't scale is talking to your customers. I know it's easier to hide behind laptops and work on your product, but you might end up building something very complex, very intricate that takes a lot of time and a lot of money, but no one really wants, or no one understands why they should want it. So I think there's a reason why, if you look at the tech world, you usually see at least two founders. One of them's a tech guy, the other one is not. So the person who's not a tech guy, their job has to be talking to people, even if they don't have a product. I recently talked to someone who was trying to build an alternative to um, email marketing platforms, and they asked me to just to pick my brain to see how I use email platforms. They have no product yet; they're working on it, but I really like the way they structured their interview because they wanted
Mhm.
to know what I liked about the platform that I'm currently using, what I disliked about it, what other features I'd be interested in, what features they were thinking about adding. And because, old habits die hard, I even suggested, you should record this and use some of the language that
Mm.
I'm using because it's probably the language your customer is using. And essentially, when you're trying to build something new, it's very, very important to understand the way your
Yeah.
customers are talking about what they need.
Love that. Sort of have two questions around this. Firstly, how, if at all, would your advice change for an existing organization? You know, established, profitable, etc., but they're just wanting to explore a new area. Would your advice change in any way, or would there be additional things that they could perhaps do to learn about their customers' pain points and needs?
So if they're looking to expand, I know this is expansion or pivots, they're fairly divisive because you have that crowd that says we've been doing things this way forever. Why should we change? Why mess with success and so on? But also the crowd that says we need to stay ahead of the game, and they suggest these insane pivots, like sort of like what Under Armour did when they tried to move from selling clothes and accessories to becoming a tech giant who has fitness apps and so on. And that pivot didn't work for them because they bit more than they could chew, and the customers really didn't understand what they were after. I mean, they love their clothes, but my fitness pal, why is that happening?
Hmm.
Um, and so I think there's an art and a science to these pivots to implementing change. The blanket advice says you should go gradual. You cannot spring a complete change on your customers. It would be like Coca-Cola starting to sell fitness trackers. People don't expect that. But if you plan to do this, whether it's incremental change or whether it's sudden change, again, you need to talk to your customers. You need to understand, you need to do focus groups to understand how these things could be received by your customers.
Love that. And if you're okay, just to dive in a bit around, so when we're having, let's take the case of a early stage founder and they're going out and meeting people that they think are perhaps their target sort of audience. What would your approach be? Because you mentioned, the pain, being a doctor and trying to diagnose. So, like, how's your approach in those early sort of conversations? Is that very exploratory, like, simply having a conversation? Like, how would you approach that?
In the very early stages, it should definitely be exploratory, and your questions should be as open as possible because again, you're trying to capture the customer language, and you need to be open to potential problems or issues that you didn't even consider, but the user knows of. If you look at the jobs to be done framework, for instance, one of the things you want to know is how your potential customer is getting a job done before having even heard about your product. Because you might find that you have competitors, direct or indirect, that you didn't even consider until now. This only happens if you let the customer do the talking. If you give them a quick survey with 3 options for every question, there's no room for exploration and there's no room for them going off on a tangent. I know it takes
Uh,
a long time. I know it's hard to quantify the results, but I also know it's worth it.
I love that, and also jobs to be done is close to my heart as well. As I love sort of using that tool in a lot of situations, and that I'm interested though in terms of you've had these great exploratory conversations, learnt a whole lot of about their life, their frustrations, all that sort of thing. How do you prioritize, or is that more of a hunch, or do you have a way of prioritizing what you believe is the real core issues here that you want to build some messaging around?
Your first signal is that some things start to repeat themselves and you start to see patterns. If you have 3 people who mention the same challenge, the same pain point, then you know that it's something you should really, really push forward. Another thing you can do is try to qualify those pains during a call and to find out if it's something that people treat as a nice to have or as a must have. Again, for that to happen, you need a little bit of volume.
Okay. And what sort of volume would you sort of frequently sort of run within the early stages to get going and start testing some messaging? Would it be a five-ish interviews, or are you talking into the 20s and 30s?
It depends a lot on your industry. So if you're building something that's very niche and appeals to a small segment of people, yes, 5 is a good number. But if you're trying to overturn Salesforce and become the next CRM, then you're obviously going to need more than that. There's a workaround that you can use when you don't have access to a lot of potential clients, or when you don't have clients of your own. You can go to review websites and find out what people are saying about your competitors and try to capture language from there, or you can use some sort of AI tool or a scraper to mine places like Reddit, because that's where people are the most truthful when talking about the products that they use. And to some extent, you can do this to substitute customer interviews. But again, nothing beats a one-on-one conversation, exploratory conversation.
I love that approach, and that's definitely something that we recommend to founders or leaders that are innovating. Is that the first tools that we use is what we call compassionate conversations. So going out and exploring, and that's certainly my approach as well. As I have maybe 2 to 3 sort of prompting questions that are very open, and then just explore and see what comes up in terms of pains and that. So hey, thanks very much for sharing that example. Maybe now, just to as we look to wrap up, if you wouldn't mind sharing perhaps one last piece of advice there for people who are looking to innovate, start a business. What's one last thing that you'd like to leave them with?
Assume it will take you at least 40% longer than you than you originally planned for, because this is how things go when you're in tech or outside of tech. Something is always going to take longer. It's just like building a house. Budget
I
for
love
more time and for more money than your initial plan.
Yeah, I love that, and we need to be very optimistic when we're doing this work, but also there is the reality as well, and I find that too, Adriana. Hey, look, thank you very much for spending time with me today. Really appreciate your wisdom and expertise in the field of marketing and copywriting and messaging, creating that strategy that founders and innovators definitely need. So, thank you very much for your time. So, Adriana, just as we wrap up, would you mind just sharing how and where the audience can reach out to you?
Absolutely. So you can find me at adrianatica.com. You can find me on LinkedIn. If you go to my website, adrianatica.com, you can also subscribe to Strategic AF, my newsletter. And I think you're going to like the first emails that you get, because I work really hard at making sure everyone gets a personalized experience from the second email or so. So I hope to see you there.
Fantastic. Thanks very much.
Thank you too, Vaughn. I had an amazing time chatting with you.
Bye for now.